Hey everyone, welcome to the Doctrine of Jesus class. Um, this is week one. So today we'll do a little intro of the class, a little intro of myself, and kind of an overview of the doctrine of Jesus. So maybe this topic is new to you. Maybe you are very familiar with the topic of who Jesus is, but we want to get everyone on the same page here as we start the class. And so a little intro. I've been teaching at Horizon now for many years. Taught theology classes, Bible classes. Um, I've taught practical theology classes, you name it. And so really have been kind of stooped in a lot of doctrine, theology, Bible, which again, this class will be focused on, the doctrine of Jesus, but particularly biblical central view of who Jesus is, and then church history, and then we'll deal with some contemporary issues at the end. I have a master's in divinity and master's in theology from Talbot School of Theology. I was a pastor for a couple of years in Hollywood. Now mainly a property manager, but and was a missionary for 3 years or 2 years. So a lot of experience, different experience within the church community, within Christianity. I did not grow up in a church. Gave my life to Jesus when I was about 18. And so the whole church experience, growing up in a church, was foreign to me. And even now, like, if you look at it, the church is weird. There's a lot of weird things about the church generally. So as we get even in this class into the doctrine of Jesus, there are things about Jesus and the doctrine of Jesus that are just weird, are just odd. And so we'll talk about some of those. So if you've had me before, this is going to function very similar as all the online classes that we've done will. If you are new to my classes, make sure you go over to the syllabus here that I will send to you and ask any questions you may have. So let's look at the syllabus. This is the Doctrine of Jesus. This is ST 605. That makes it a high master's level class. So we're going to talk a lot about theological issues, and the assumption is that you have a foundation in regards to some of these issues. So if you have any questions, let me know. General information and description of the class is a study of the doctrine of Jesus, or Christology, with a special focus on the biblical, historical, and contemporary perspectives as they relate to the person and works of Jesus. Things I would hope for you to get out of this class: demonstrate comprehensive knowledge of Jesus Christ and his work, especially in the New Testament. 2, convey clearly the theological issues and controversies surrounding the doctrine of Jesus, both through church history and in present day. Number 3, define and describe the theological terminology of Christology. Number 4, summarize the theological contribution, contemporary Western and contemporary contextual theologies, or theologians and theologies. And so basically through history, what have they said about the Christology of Jesus? And then 2, what do they say now? What are the big issues? Some of those ideas. And then 5, articulate your own personal theological conviction with grace and your life as a disciple of Jesus. So basically articulate your own position of Christology and how does that relate to you, and what have you learned in regards to who Jesus is. Required text is the Ben Witherington Christology of Jesus. Grab this one back here. That's this book. For this class, you'll see a lot of the reading. There's some recommended reading in terms of the list. If you only buy one book, buy that one. Kind of an overview of all the other ones. But some recommended ones, if you want just a foundational book, R.C. Sproul, Who is Jesus? This one is very similar to the Christology of Jesus, same author, the many faces of Christ. And this book, Witherington, really covers more of the biblical New Testament kind of gospel presentations of who Jesus is. And so that's what that book is. Some other books here, if you want more about the Trinitarian perspective of Jesus and the Trinity. The Fred Sanders book, The Jesus and the Trinitarian Perspective, is a good one. If you're used to this theology and doctrine of Jesus and you want to be challenged in terms of your theology and understanding, Moltmann's The Crucified God is a good one. It will definitely stretch those boundaries of your understanding and raise some questions that will challenge your own view and understanding of Jesus and Christology. And then finally, one at the end there, God Sent His Son, A Contemporary Christology. This one's from a kind of a more of a contemporary view, issues that are happening. And I believe that one is also the Roman Catholic. I'd have to look that up. But the Roman Catholic and talks a lot about the history, not only contemporary view of Christology, but the history through kind of church. So that one's a good one, through both a Catholic theological perspective or view of Christology, and also an overview of history and their view of Jesus. So I'll be referencing that one as that's Christology of the Later Fathers by Hardy. That's the Catholic view. And then God Sent His Son is a contemporary one. So the Christology of the Later Fathers by Hardy, that one's the Catholic overview. I'll be referencing that one. The second one there is more of a contemporary view of issues in current day. So if we look at the course schedule, week 1 we'll introduce the class, Who is Jesus? Why is Jesus? Going over the syllabus now. Week 2 we'll cover biblical Christology. What do we mean by that? Basically, what did Jesus say about himself, and what did Jesus do? Week 3 we will continue the discussion on biblical Christology, and we will talk about what others in the biblical text say about Jesus. Week 4, we'll get into the historical Christology, so looking through the church history perspective. Then we'll have our midterm. Week 6, we'll get into more contemporary Christology, so issues and topics that are more coming up today, and how do we address those. And then the last kind of 3 weeks are more issues that have come up that church and people still talk about. They've been a little bit more of a focus throughout church history, early church history, but there's still things we need to talk about. So week 7, this deity and humanity of Jesus. How do they interrelate? What does this mean that he's both human and both God at the same time? Week 8, Christology, atonement. And so this is what happened on the cross and views of atonement. And then finally, their implications for life. So given all of this, what does it mean for us? What does it mean for you? What does it mean for our relationship with God? What does it mean of who Jesus said he was and what he did? And we'll have a final exam. And so one midterm, one final exam, and then your weekly assignments each week. So I'll include a lecture, several additional videos. Make sure you watch all the videos. Complete the assignment. Don't Google answers for the assignments and copy and paste other people's words. Please write it yourself, and so you won't get credit if it's something you copy and pasted, 1. And 2, if you do that from a Google source, most likely it's going to be wrong. And so make sure you're watching the videos. Your participation in this class, because the class is all online, your participation is sending in those weekly assignments. I know that you've watched the lecture and the videos if you send in the assignments. Without those, you don't get credit for attending the class. Grading scale, you can see there, and then finally grade assessment at the bottom. Your weekly assignments are worth 40 points of your grade. Your midterm, 20 points. Your final exam, 40 points. What does that mean? Basically, it means you need to do the weekly assignments. You can't pass the class if you don't do the weekly assignments. For those that have been in my class, the exams are hard. They're not easy. There is a curve on the exams, but generally they're not easy. So it means please do the weekly assignments. If you have any questions over the syllabus, you can email me and ask. So we start off in this class talking about our primary question. Our primary question is, who is Jesus? I mean, that's what this class is about. Obviously, we're going to get into more of just who is Jesus, and we're going to get into kind of more theology and answer some other questions. But this is the primary question. And we know that Jesus was a historical person. We know he existed in the first century. We know he was crucified by the hands of the Romans. And we know that historically, most likely, at minimum, he was a Jewish rabbi who lived in the first century. But the question is there anything else we can really know about Jesus? You might have questions that you bring to this class about this subject in regards to Jesus, or maybe you've heard other questions or things that have been said about who Jesus is, and whether or not those are true or not, or accurate to what Jesus said about himself and what others said about him in the first century. So that includes is what we know about Jesus only a myth? Was it a made-up story by the disciples? Was this whole thing about Jesus and being resurrected fabricated and made as this story? The second are the stories created by the disciples about a person in history. And so did the disciples make up the story to kind of make themselves look better? Was he only a rabbi, just this teacher? Didn't really say everything that's attributed to him, maybe some of the things. And so first century followers of Jesus made him out to more than maybe he said about himself. Was he a prophet? Did he speak for God? Was he this guru kind of person that didn't say that there's only one way to God and there is only one God, but more just wanted people to love each other and get along? Did Jesus actually intend everything that was attributed to him? Did he intend the disciples to follow him and think he was God? Was that even his intention? And then finally, there's the issue of whether he was just a human being or whether he was fully divine, and that aspect and questions that come up in regards to Jesus. And in order to answer these questions, we will focus on the person and work of Jesus through a biblical, historical, and contemporary perspective, and attempt to answer the question, who is Jesus? So in this class, we will attempt to show that Jesus was just more than a Jewish rabbi of the first century crucified by the hands of the Romans. Although this is the minimum, the least we can say about who Jesus is, we can't say anything less about Jesus historically, as it pertains both to the historical accounts of Jesus in the biblical narrative and also other sources. I believe we can say more about who Jesus is. And so we will attempt to answer this question, and not just answer this question in a relativistic point of view of who is Jesus to you or who is Jesus to another person, but rather objectively as much as we can, who is Jesus, of who Jesus said he was and what he did and how that reflects on the identity nature of who Jesus is and ultimately the very nature of God. In one of the additional videos, it addresses some of these thoughts, rationalizations of Jesus being something else. What if Jesus is just this, or a liar, or the disciples made it up? And so they address some of those issues, so make sure you watch that video. Also, one of the one of the Christian writers in history, actually more 20th century, C.S. Lewis, he wrote that really looking at what Jesus said and he did, we really only have three conclusions that we can make regarding this. And at the end of the day, you could, at the end of this class, conclude one of these three things regarding who Jesus is. It would be very, very difficult to conclude something different other than these three. But first, Jesus was crazy, that he made everything up. He just was way, way out there. Number two, he was a pathological liar, that he just lied about everything. He was fully sane, but just lied. Or finally, what Jesus said about himself is actually true, that we can take Jesus at his word, and he was the divine Son of God. Those are kind of our three options. So either he's fully crazy, he's a liar, or he actually is God. So, to conclude, as you can see in one of those videos, that they just say the disciples made everything up about Jesus. Historically, it just doesn't make sense. Also, if that were true, then we would have other accounts of it being refuted, other historical documents in which we don't. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through the class. That gets us into the why of Jesus. So both the who of Jesus and then the why of Jesus. Now this question of why gets to the root of why study Jesus at all, why you have this class, why is Jesus so important. That could be important in regards to in history, important as a historical figure, or important in regards to what Jesus said about himself and what others said about him. But regardless, there is an importance and hence a class to study who Jesus is. Now, I've mentioned the word Christology a couple of times. This comes from the root of ology, which is study, and then Christ. So the study of Christ, Christ being the Messiah or the anointed one. So in the Old Testament, we have Messiah, and then in the New Testament in Greek is Christ. And so Old Testament would be Hebrew, Messiah, New Testament, Christ, Greek, meaning the same thing, the Messiah or the anointed one. And so as we talk about Jesus Christ, it's Jesus the anointed one. Christ is not a surname, a last name, or a reference. The expectation from Israel was for the anointed one of God that would set everything right. This includes everything involved in regards to the Messiah. The study of the person and work of Jesus is at the center of all Christian theology and thought. What we will see in this class is precisely what Jesus said about himself, that he is this messianic figure, this Christ that the Jews were waiting for, and the fulfillment of prophetic fulfillment of prophecy of the Old Testament. Christology then is the study of everything Jesus did and everything Jesus said about himself, and that includes the implications for those who follow Jesus, the implications for the followers of Jesus in the first century, and the implications for us today. Now, there are different ways of getting to this root of who is Jesus and why is Jesus. In contemporary culture, this focus has been more on the humanity of Jesus, or rather, how can we understand Jesus as a person? And so, as culture has pushed towards a postmodern view of everything, questioning everything, analyzing everything, questioning even knowledge itself and trying to get to a level of authenticity. What happens then is viewing Jesus as saying, okay, all these things maybe that were said about Jesus, that's fine, but what about this person, Jesus, who lived in the first century? What about that human person? And so there's a level of deconstruction to try to get to answering the who is Jesus and why is Jesus strictly on what we can understand about the person of Jesus. Now, this process started kind of in the 20th century, and it was called the Search for the Historical Jesus. Most notable for this was a group called the Jesus Seminar. And what they did is they tried to figure out who Jesus was as a person in the first century, minus all of the theological churchy stuff. And so by doing, they took away all the miraculous things about Jesus. So basically, by getting rid of all the miraculous aspects of Jesus, the Jesus Seminar kind of deconstructs down to what is understandable, what is relatable regarding the human Jesus. So that means anything where Jesus says he was God, Jesus resurrecting from the dead, any of the miracles that just don't make sense to their own human experience have to be New Testament attributing those things or saying those things about Jesus, and Jesus didn't say those things about himself. And so what they do is they go through the New Testament and they rate things that are most likely authentic about what Jesus said about himself. And again, deconstructing down to this human Jesus. Now, the problem is there's no evidence biblically, in the New Testament, or historically of what they can eliminate regarding what Jesus would say about himself and attribute only to what was said about him in regards to the writers of the New Testament. The other problem is deconstructing everything down to what is understandable just doesn't make sense. Not everything is understandable. Miracles happen in the world. There are things that happen in the world that we cannot explain. And by doing so, they come with a certain assumption about the question, who is Jesus, and then try to force history to agree with that assumption. They attempt to, what they call, make a distinction between the Christ of faith, the divine aspect, the Christ, the Messiah aspect of Jesus, the faith aspect of God and Jesus, versus the Jesus of history, the first century Jewish man who walked around as a rabbi. And so for them, there is a person who lived in the first century that is separate from the mysterious divine nature that others attribute to him. And for them, the only authentic one is the one that lived in the first century. This brings up a question for us that we will look more closely at later on in the class, which is, did God just use a man in history named Jesus, or was Jesus something more? How should we understand really the divine aspect of Jesus? Was he just an anointed man, an inspired man, or was Jesus actually God in the flesh? They are correct in some ways in regards to the history of the church. We've disregarded a lot of aspects of the humanity of Jesus, and we've made kind of Jesus more the divine faith, mysterious aspect. And by doing that, we've made Jesus very unrelatable to ourselves or to humanity. And so the benefit of this movement in the 20th and 21st century is to make Jesus more human, more relatable to us. And so there's an element of that that is helpful. And so there's something about Christology, as we talk about Christology, in view of the humanity of Jesus that speaks to the humanity of all of us, something we can relate to, one, and two, this then relate in regards to relationship with God, relate to Jesus as it relates to our relationship with God. If Jesus is only human, then perhaps we've missed the point of regarding Jesus' own words and actions, assuming all of those are accurate to who Jesus was in the first century. Erickson writes in his systematic theology book, the life and teachings and ministry of Jesus, including his death and resurrection, are not part of a unique type of history, distinct from the history in general. What he means by this is there wasn't this history of this Jesus man that lived in the first century that is separate than the history of what Jesus said about himself as being the Christ of God. There's no two separate histories. There's one history of the person of Jesus, who is also the Christ. There are ways to then categorize these, as William Lane Craig does in his video. Categorizes the person of Christ and the work of Christ to help us understand the different nuances of Jesus. And so these are helpful separations of the person, work of Christ to then analyze and understand and describe who Jesus is. This is not to say that we should separate the person from the work of Christ. The person of Christ from the work of Christ, as the Jesus Seminar would try to do, but rather when we do create these helpful categories, then it helps us then to describe, analyze, and look at these different aspects of Jesus. Now, at the core of why Jesus is this idea of the incarnation. Now, the incarnation, just kind of a fancy word for this idea of God, the one God, creator God of the universe, coming into creation and becoming a person. Now, how that works, right, is this person fully God and fully human, only human, right? We'll talk a little bit about that later when we talk about the humanity and divinity of Christ. But for now, it's this idea of God coming to us. Now here is a diagram. I'm not sure if this will show up. I will probably just send, focus. It might be backwards. I'll just send this as part of the assignment. This was from when I had taught this class previously. And if you look at this diagram, you'll see a couple of important things. One, we have this idea of the fullness of God. And so in the far left, the attributes of God, the nature of God. And within the attributes and nature of God is what we would understand as you look to the right here, the Godhead, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So the Trinity. The Father is God, the Son is God, the Holy Spirit is God, but the Son is not the Holy Spirit. The Father is not the Son. And so we understand that Trinity is God is one nature, one being. It's called ousia in Greek. So one ousia, but three distinct different persons, or we could say instead of persons, personhood. Hypostases, it would be the Greek word for that. And so in Orthodox kind of Christian theology, it's one ousia, three hypostases, and that all comes from those Greek words. And we'll look through that a little bit when we look through church history. But God being of one nature, they are distinct persons. And yet inseparable. You can't draw a line between them, but they are yet distinct. So that's there on the right. Now you take all of that idea of the Godhead and then go back over to the circle on the left of the attributes. All of those attributes and the nature of God is there. And now we have this separation between humanity and God. As this always, we have this search for God. Humanity's been searching. Who is God? How do I please God? What does it mean? And we've created all of these kind of religions and ideas of how to do that. But the incarnation then is this idea of God coming to us. Now, if we said, well, the fullness of the Godhead came to us, and let's say God died, so if the wholeness of God, say, came into creation and something happens, does that mean the universe falls apart? Right? So there's questions of that, of God coming into creation. That's where you get, Greek mythologies of a god, right? There's different gods and control different things, and a god might take human form or something like that. So here we have the fullness of the attributes of God, the very nature of God, and then the incarnation would be, as we follow those lines down, the image of the Father. And so part of the Trinitarian nature, the image of the Father, the representation of and presentation of the Godhead in fullness coming into humanity. So there we could see the box of the Son then coming down into creation. And what we get from that is a voluntary limiting of divine ability. So we'll talk about that a little bit more later. We talk about the humanity, divinity of Christ, this idea that there's a voluntary limiting of this divine ability. We see Jesus saying, I don't know the will of the Father. It is the will of the Father, the timing of the Father, and that I don't know. Well, if he's actually part of the Godhead, I mean, in theory, he does know, but there's this temporary limiting of it. And so here under that, so we get this image that is fully connected back to the attributes and nature of God. And so Jesus being the image of the Father then is a direct correlation to who God is, the nature of who God is. So the actions of Jesus, the sayings of Jesus reflect the sayings, nature, and work of God as a Godhead. We also see Jesus interacting both with the Father in the New Testament and by the power of the Holy Spirit, third person of the Trinity. And so we see these other dynamics involved here. And so Jesus, being a Jewish man, rabbi of the first century, embodying all of that, also a reflection and embodying this fullness of who God is. So you can see the Jesus of history, Christ of faith there, that we had talked about previously with the Jesus seminar. So there's a lot going on in that diagram, but the idea here is that the concept of the incarnation then is very, very important, understanding who Jesus is and also understanding who God is. The incarnation is an indication of who God is and what God does. This being a direct correlation of God coming into the flesh and a direct reflection of the attributes and nature of God as part of the Godhead. And so if this is all true, then the incarnation is an indication of what God would say about humanity and how God would respond. And so this then answering the question, why Jesus? Well, the why Jesus, if all of this is true, and if what Jesus said about himself is true, is vitally important to understanding our own humanity and who God is. And so we'll talk a little bit more about this again when we see what Jesus says about himself and what others say about Jesus. But hopefully the diagram will be a good starting point in understanding this idea of the incarnation. Also, Dr. William Lane Craig's video talks a little bit more about that, the incarnation. So what we see is the concept of Christology really does encompass most, if not all, really, of Christian doctrine regarding to how, one, we understand God or theology, 2, how we understand our own humanity, our anthropology, and our own sin, our own brokenness. 3, what it means that God forgives and saves us, and so that's the fancy word for that would be soteriology. And then finally, how this transaction then happens. So that would be the theory of atonement and this idea of salvation and sanctification. All of these terms and in this relationship with God, all coming back to the very nature of Christology. Now, part of the diagram is, if you've been in my classes before or have taken the Doctrine of God, we talked about that circle a lot more. What does it mean that God has attributes and personality, and what does it mean who God is, and how can we study God, and how can we understand God? All of that is part of that class. So it's jumping off of that and saying, well, you have all of the attributes and nature of God now, then being reflected and represented in humanity, which is the doctrine of Jesus in studying Christology. So in this class, we'll first study the words and the work of Jesus, and then as they reflect about the nature of who Jesus is, we can assume that what Jesus said about himself are accurate reflections of Jesus' own self-awareness. And then we'll look at what others say about Jesus from those who knew him. Then we will continue that conversation kind of through church history, beginning of church history, through church history, up until kind of contemporary conversations regarding who Jesus is, and regarding the doctrine of Jesus, and then finally some of those important doctrines such as humanity, divinity of Jesus, and our relationship with who Jesus is. So that's the class as we go forward, and looking forward to a good quarter.